The Slavs are one of the largest linguistic and cultural groups on the planet. Today, their descendants live from the Adriatic to the Pacific Ocean. They speak dozens of languages and dialects. But the deeper we try to look into the past, the more obscure their origins become. What was their homeland, and how and why did they spread across vast territories? And were there any Slavs in ancient times at all, or did this name only appear in neighbor chronicles? The answers to these questions lie at the intersection of archaeology, linguistics, and to some extent in the speculations of ancient historians. Today, we will examine the versions, facts, and theories to understand where the history of the Slavs begins. You are on the Amazing History channel, a place where we explore what usually remains between the lines of textbooks. This video, like many others on the channel, is made possible by our viewers and sponsors. Your support helps us to prepare scripts, find rare sources, and create illustrations that make history visual. If you want to join and help the community and the project, the links are in the description. Thank you to everyone already with us. It is you who make new episodes possible. Let's get to this episode's topic. Searching for the origins of the Slavs makes a historian feel more like a detective than a chronicler. The ancient Slavs didn't have their own writing system, which means we are left without a direct voice. Everything that was written about them in early antiquity and early Middle Ages came from their neighbors, Byzantines, Romans, and Gothic chroniclers. These authors looked at the Slavs through the eyes of outsiders, sometimes with open hostility, and could confuse tribes, mix up events, and attribute foreign customs to them. Archaeology does not always provide a clear answer. Pottery, jewelry, and weapons can be found among peoples of different origins. Trade and borrowing erase cultural boundaries. Sometimes archaeologists find similar settlements hundreds of kilometers apart, but this is not yet proof that Slavs actually lived there. Linguistics, it would seem, can restore ancient languages, but even here there is no unanimity. Reconstructions of the Proto-Slavic language are based on conjectures and comparisons with related Indo-European languages, and each set of new dataset can overturn old conclusions. As a result, we don't have a single reliable source, only a mosaic of archaeological finds, outside descriptions, and linguistic traces. And the researcher's task is to assemble a plausible picture from these fragments, understanding that it will never be complete. The location of the Slavs' homeland has remained open for centuries. There are no serious written records about the early period of their history, so theories are based on archaeological findings and linguistic reconstructions. The most popular hypothesis points to the Policy region, the border area between present-day Belarus and Ukraine. Here, in the Dnipro basin, there existed the so-called Kiev culture. Its settlements, the form of dwellings, and the nature of ceramics are often associated with the ancestors of the Slavs. The geographical location is attractive. It was a natural river junction convenient for settlement in all directions. Other versions place the homeland farther west, near the Wisla and Oder rivers. Proponents of this theory point to archaeological cultures that existed here in late antiquity and to mentions of the Wends in Roman sources who may have been related to the Slavs. There are also bolder ideas. Some researchers link the origins of the Slavs to the south of modern Ukraine and even to the distant steppes of Central Asia, relying on possible contacts with the Yamnaya culture, one of the proposed homelands of the Indo-Europeans. However, these theories are hard to prove, as links between archaeological finds and specific ethnic groups are too weak. None of the versions has received full recognition so far, and perhaps this may never happen. Most likely, the Proto-Slavic world was not a single point on the map, but a whole zone of related cultures that existed at different times and gradually merged into what we now call the Slavs. The first vague outlines of the future Slavs appear in the texts of Roman authors from the 1st and 2nd centuries AD. Plinius the Elder and Tacitus mention a people called the Venedi. They supposedly lived east of the Wisla in lands that today belong to Poland and Belarus. The Romans avoided defining their relationship with their neighbors, describing the Venedi as neither Germanic nor completely foreign. Over the centuries, Byzantine historian Procopius of Caesarea, who lived at Emperor Justinian's court, provided a more detailed description. He writes about tall, often red-haired people lived to the east of the Wisla who govern themselves democratically. That is, they elect their leaders and worship a single god of thunder. This god is easily recognized as Perun, the chief thunderer of Slavic paganism. Almost at the same time, the Gothic historian Jordanes, in his Getica, tells about the Venedi, Sclaveni, and Antes, implying that all three names describe related tribes. He places the Sclaveni north of the Danube and the Antes between the Dniester and the Dnipro. He calls both peoples warlike, prone to raids on Byzantine lands. In the 6th century Byzantine military treatise Strategikon, the Antes are mentioned as skilled warriors, capable of independent action and not afraid to fight a stronger opponent. Perhaps these very tribes became the foundation for the future southern and eastern Slavs. However, all this information is an outside perspective. The authors could have mixed up the tribes, called them by different names depending on geography or political system. Therefore, we cannot say for sure where real observations end and stereotypes or assumptions begin. The middle of the first millennium AD was a time of tremendous change for Europe. The Great Migration swept across the continent. It was a chain reaction of tribal movements triggered by the invasion of the Huns and the collapse of the Roman Empire. For the Slavs, this was the time of rare historical opportunity. When the Huns and their allies drove the Germanic tribes from the northern Black Sea and Central Europe, vast areas were left nearly deserted. To the west of the presumed Slavic homeland in Policia and the upper Dnipro, their former neighbors vanished, revealing new lands ahead. The Slavic tribes began a slow but steady expansion. Some moved west, settling the lands from the Oder to the Elbe. These are the future Western Slavs, Poles, Czechs, Slovaks, and Lusatian Serbs. Others went south over the Carpathians and Danube into the Balkans, where southern Slavs, Serbs, Croats, Slovenes, and Bulgarians were formed. The third group headed southeast into the fertile steppes of the Black Sea region, and then north. This marked the start of Eastern Slavs' history. Rivers served as primary migration routes. Tribes traveled along the Dnipro, Wisla, Danube, and their tributaries, settling in fertile areas before moving deeper into the continent. The migration was not a single organized process. It was a long process that lasted for centuries. Individual clans and tribal unions searched for better lands, escaping military threats, or pursued opportunities for trade and plunder. But it was during this era that the territorial distribution of the Slavs was formed, which became the foundation of their history in the Middle Ages. As they settled across Europe, the Slavs did not exist in isolation. In every direction, they encountered neighbors. This contact inevitably changed them as well. In the west and southwest, they occupied lands that previously belonged to the Celts and the Germans. Here, the Slavs adopted certain crafts, types of jewelry, and methods of warfare. Even in the language, borrowings from Germanic dialects have been preserved, especially in the names of trade goods and weapons. In the south, in the Balkans, they encountered the remnants of Roman provincial civilization and the Byzantine Empire. The Slavs adopted agricultural technologies, military organization, and aspects of Christian culture from the Byzantines. Long before the baptism, in the Black Sea steppes, Eastern Slavs neighbored Turkic-speaking nomads like the Avars, Bulgars, and later Khazars. These contacts were not just military. Nomads introduced new weapons, cavalry tactics, and possibly even individual words into the language. In the north, the Eastern Slavs entered into close interaction with the Finno-Ugric tribes. Here, large-scale mixing took place. The Slavs adopted local place names, methods of fishing and hunting, while the Finno-Ugric people contributed their genes and cultural traits to the future northern Russian communities. This constant interpenetration of cultures led to early Slavic societies being far from homogeneous. They combined their own traditions with borrowings from various sources, and their material culture reflected a complex network of connections throughout Eastern and Central Europe. There is a point of view that turns the usual idea of the origin of the Slavs upside down. It was proposed by the historian Florin Curta. In his opinion, in the early Middle Ages, there was no single Proto-Slavic people as we understand it. Instead, the idea of Slavdom arose as a political construct. Kurta believes that Byzantine authors of the 6th and 7th centuries, when describing the tribes on the northern borders of the empire, began to unite them under a common name, Sclaveni. These tribes could have been reflected, receiving a similar status as federates, allies, and mercenaries of Byzantium. Over time, the common label became established even in the eyes of the tribes themselves. According to this theory, the Slavs were initially more of a political category than an ethnic one. They were united by both their similar languages and their shared roles with the empire, raiding its lands, serving in the army, and engaging in diplomacy. Gradually, these groups adopted each other's customs and language, and the name Slavs became part of their self-identification. Critics of the theory point out that it better explains the formation of the South Slavic tribes in the Balkans, but does not cover the Eastern and Northern Slavs, who developed separately from Byzantium. In addition, linguistic data still indicate the existence of a common Proto-Slavic language long before the appearance of Byzantine chronicles. Nevertheless, Kurta's idea is useful in that it reminds us that ethnic identity is not always a legacy from ancient times, but is often the result of political and cultural processes. For ancient people, being part of the Slavs was rarely important. His world ended with his clan, tribe, or at most a tribal union. These were real communities that could be seen, that one could turn to for help, and with whom lands were shared. The early medieval Slavs did not have unified states or common religions. They were united by similar languages and customs, but each clan lived by its own traditions and obeyed its own leaders. Even neighbors with similar languages could be bitter enemies. The first signs of supertribal identity began to form only through contact with stronger political entities, Byzantium, the Khazar Khaganate, and later Kievan Rus and Poland. But even then, this feeling was more often limited to the nobility, who took part in diplomacy and military alliances. For most people, what mattered was who your relatives were, where your land was, and who protected your settlement. These people and local ties determined whom to join, pay tribute to, and consider your own. The idea of a common Slavic identity, in the modern sense, was too abstract for them. The history of the Slavs' origin isn't about locating one spot, but understanding a complex centuries-long process. We see how tribes with common linguistic roots settled across Europe, changed under the influence of their neighbors, and influenced them in return. They adopted technologies, words, beliefs, and military techniques, creating a culture where their own traditions mixed with borrowings. Attempts to find a single homeland yield different results, from Polisia to Wisla and even the steppes of southern Ukraine. But it seems more accurate to speak not about a birthplace, but about a zone of formation, a region where related cultures converged and intertwined. Early written records about the Slavs reflect outsider views, blending observations, politics, and legends. We know them as the Venedi, the Antai, the Sclaveni, but behind these names are real people whose sense of belonging was much narrower and more specific. Ultimately, the formation of the Slavs is a story of how local communities, step by step, became part of a larger world. And even though debates about the place of their origin, migration routes, and even the very concept of the Slavs continue, one thing is clear. From a mosaic of tribes, languages, and cultures, one of the most numerous and influential peoples of Europe emerged. That's all from my side. Thank you for watching. Write in the comments about which other peoples we should make a video. Well, goodbye. See you next time. Bye all. To be continued.